Hello, and welcome to our panel on the new domestic violence laws. I am your moderator, Tanesha Ash-Shakoor. I have my Juris Doctor, and I am a domestic violence advocate, educator, expert witness, DV intervention facilitator, a statewide speaker, trainer, survivor myself, and the CEO and founder of Voices of Color, who works tirelessly to be the voice for the voiceless. First, I am going to ask Dr. April Zeoli to give us some background on domestic violence in Michigan and nationally. What is the scale of this problem, and what changes when there is a gun in the picture?
Thank you, Tanesha. I am just going to share my screen, and this is, that moment we all freeze and go, is it going to work? I think it's working. Yes. Okay. So, intimate partner violence is extremely common. It occurs throughout the United States, and about just under 1 in 2 women will be the victims of intimate partner sexual assault, physical violence, or stalking in their lifetimes. Guns are used in intimate partner violence situations in non-lethal ways. They're used to intimidate the victim, to threaten the victim, to hold the victim at gunpoint, to pistol whip, that's using a gun as a club, shooting at and threatening children. Essentially, guns are an incredibly effective tool to get someone to do what you want them to do. I don't know about you, but if someone's holding a gun on me, I'm going to do what they tell me to do. If somebody tells me they're going to shoot me and I know that they have a gun, I'm going to do what they tell me to do so that I don't get shot. And this is the fear that people who are experiencing partner victimization live with. In a nationally representative survey, the National Crime Victimization Survey, they found that about 3.4% of non-fatal intimate partner violence events involved the use of a gun. Now, 3.4% doesn't sound like a lot. And in percentage-wise, it's not a lot. But because intimate partner violence is so common, that amounts to 32,900 intimate partner violence firearm involved events every year, or around 90 non-fatal gun involved intimate partner violence events every single day. And then, as we all know, guns are used to kill. This graph shows intimate partner homicide rates from 1990 through 2020, broken down as firearm and non-firearm intimate partner homicide, or IPH. The blue line on top is the firearm intimate partner homicide rate. And you can see that it is quite elevated compared to the non-firearm intimate partner homicide rate throughout this entire period. But we see something happening. We're seeing both intimate partner homicide with firearms and non-firearms, go down from 1990. They're decreasing, both of them. And then we get to 2014. And here the lines really start diverging because non-firearm intimate partner homicide stays pretty level. But intimate partner homicides committed with firearms pick up. There's an increase. And we're still trying to figure out, somebody's going to ask in the Q&A, why did intimate partner homicide with firearms start increasing in 2014? And the answer is we don't really know, but homicides with firearms, more general homicides with firearms started increasing in 2014 as well. So there's definitely something, going on there that we haven't completely identified yet. And then I always present intimate partner homicide rates by race in addition to weapon, because it's incredibly important that we realize where the burden of intimate partner homicide lies. And this graph, the blue line at the top, is the Black intimate partner homicide rate. The red line is white intimate partner homicide rate, and the green line is neither white nor black intimate partner homicide rates. And I wish I had more categories instead of, white, black, and other. But the data sets that are out there on this, that the FBI supplies, really don't have much more than that. So we see, from 1990 through 2020, white and other intimate partner homicide rates, they go down, but they're relatively flat lines. Black intimate partner homicide is so much higher. That rate is so much higher than for white victims or other victims. At the closest point in roughly 2014, 2015, Black intimate partner homicide is 3 times higher than that of white intimate partner homicide. And right after that, we start seeing an increase, the same increase that we saw with firearm intimate partner homicide. So when we're talking about the need for interventions, we really need culturally appropriate and specific interventions designed for Black communities. So let me talk about one of the laws that Michigan just passed in the fall. This law says that if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, you can't purchase or possess a gun for 8 years, until 8 years after that penalty is over, until your jail sentence is served or probation or parole. So there's been some research on this law, similar laws. The federal government has a similar law that prohibits those convicted of misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence from having guns. That's a lifetime ban. The Michigan is for 8 years. And the Michigan law is also a little bit broader. It covers more types of intimate partner violence than the federal law does. So with that federal law, we see a 9% decrease in intimate partner homicide and a 31% decrease in the domestic homicides of male children. Now, other states have their own versions of this law as well. And states that have the law but have included a relinquishment provision, which is a part of the law that states that after someone has been prohibited from having a gun, a judge is authorized to order them to turn in any guns they already possess, or have law enforcement go and remove them. When states include that in the law, there's an associated decrease of homicides of pregnant and postpartum women. Homicides of pregnant and postpartum women are mainly committed by intimate partners. And it is here that we actually see a great excess of Black victims as compared to white. So we do see that this law is associated with fewer deaths, and there are places that Michigan can improve it even still. And I wanted to talk about one other that's been associated with intimate partner homicide decreases, and that's the personal protection order firearm restriction. There have been a bunch of studies on this law, and they've all found, when they look at the law in states over time, that these laws are associated with reductions in both intimate partner homicide committed with firearms and total intimate partner homicide. And it's really important that we look at total intimate partner homicide, because we don't want to just prevent firearm deaths, right? It doesn't matter if a different weapon, is used instead of a firearm. We don't want the death regardless. So we look at total intimate partner homicides to see if homicides really went down. And all of the research suggests that people aren't just using other methods to commit homicide. Intimate partner homicides are going down in the face of these laws. Lives are being saved. And there are a couple of provisions in the laws that make them more effective. And these are when the law extends to dating partners. So federally and in some states, The law only applies to current or former spouses, people who cohabited, live together, and people who share a child. And that leaves out this whole group of dating partners who can be just as violent and are just as violent as people you've lived with, married, or had a kid with. When dating partners are covered, there's a decrease in intimate partner homicide of 13%, and that's total intimate partner homicide. Michigan does have this law. When they're available, when the firearm restrictions are available on ex parte PPOs, that first order that occurs before there's a hearing that the respondent to the order can attend. When we make those available on ex parte PPOs, there's also a 13% associated decrease in intimate partner homicide. And when the law has a relinquishment provision, and again, that's something in the law that says that a court is authorized to order someone to turn in their guns or have law enforcement go and get them, we see a 10 to 12% associated decrease in intimate partner homicide. Michigan doesn't have this law, so we don't have a relinquishment provision for either the misdemeanor crime of domestic violence firearm restriction or the PPO firearm restriction. And that might be something we look to in the future, because if we're not ensuring that the people who are now illegal to have a gun don't have a gun, then by default, we're just leaving guns in their hands. We have to have some kind of protocol or policy to make sure that guns are being removed. But we have made a lot of progress in terms of evidence-based policies. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them in the chat. How do I stop share?
Yes, April. Thank you so much for that information. So to put a more human face on those statistics, we've just been provided with a plethora of information and the statistics as it relates to what Dr. Zeoli just provided us with. I am going to ask Rick and Martha Omillian to talk a little bit more about their experience in intimate partner violence.
Thank you, Tanesha. I'm going to try to share our screen here. We'll just go with that. That will work. We want to thank you for this opportunity to address the panel. I'm assuming you can all see the slides we're putting up, pictures of our daughter. We're Rick and Martha Omillian from the Kalamazoo area. I'm a retired educator, and Martha's a retired psychiatric nurse educator. We would like to share our journey of advocacy after our daughter Maggie was killed. On October 18, 1999, our daughter Maggie Wardle was killed in a murder-suicide on the campus of Kalamazoo College, near where we live in Plainwell, Michigan. Maggie grew up in Plainwell, about 10 miles from Kalamazoo College, attended Plainwell High School, excelling in classes all through her elementary and secondary years. She started at K in her quest for a medical degree. She was very good at science and open and empathetic in helping others around her, all through school. She had other opportunities to attend universities in other places in the country, but she chose Kalamazoo College because it was near home, where she could be close to her mom, her Oma, and her family. In the early morning hours of October 18th, she was murdered by an ex-boyfriend whom she met at K and dated for a short time in early 1999. She subsequently had been trying to end that relationship in the spring and summer of 1999. She returned to K in her sophomore year in August, having broken off contact with him, or so she thought. He stalked her within the small confines of the campus, with their dorms right across a parking lot from each other. At the homecoming dance on that weekend of October 17th and 18th, he was despondent, talking to his friends and dorm mates, male and female, about his feelings about the relationship and what she was, in his words, doing to him. Unknown to everyone, he had purchased a shotgun in the weekends just before October 18th and had hidden it in his room. After seeing Maggie at that dance, the homecoming weekend on campus, he reached out to her on instant messaging and asked her to come over and talk to him. He got her to come to his room, starting an argument with her that others on the floor heard. When she did not act as he wanted, he pulled out the gun, killing her and then taking his own life. If you want to know more about what happened on campus that day and the follow-up and the reaction on campus, you can read the book, The Events of October by Gail Griffin, which is available through the Wayne State University Press. In the immediate aftermath of Maggie's death, we attended vigils on campus, talked to the media, and we were able to get our emotions together enough to do that. It was difficult. We talked a lot about Maggie and her love of life and the emotional abuse that Maggie had endured from him, that we found out about specifically in detail after she died. There were things on her computer, the IM records on the server were available. Not everybody at that time wanted to call it domestic violence, especially on the campus, because of their age and where it happened on a college campus and because they weren't married. The Kalamazoo YWCA lifted us up and helped us find our voice to try to change that dialogue. But it was also campus violence, gun violence, and we really wanted to talk about those things too. As you can see in the slide, there were headlines in the paper, interviews, and campus discussions about what had happened. Our family, all of us together, Martha, myself, Rob, our son, our sister Susan, our sister Elaine. Susan is a women's rights advocate, and we all worked together to communicate on campus that something needed to change. We knew that we needed to speak up for Maggie and make the college change some things and expand services on campus. We wanted to honor her with action, so we identified 3 areas over the next few months in the year 2000 that we wanted to work on as a family to spark change in her honor. Those 3 areas were suicide prevention, because preventing his suicide would have saved Maggie's life. That's the bottom line. There were signs and things he talked about others in his circle that should have raised concern about how much danger he was in personally and emotionally, and resulted in them talking to somebody on campus about that. Secondly, we also saw the need for gun control, whatever that term means now with the divisions it causes across America. In today's dialogue, it's more active about preventing gun violence and passing the gun law reforms to do that. And the third area of concern was violence against women, which we thought at that time was pretty clear at that point. But we've learned a lot since the year 2000 and how difficult it is to get agreement and commitment for meaningful change to protect women, children, and families. In 2000, in Michigan law, we found out that the legal definition and protections around domestic violence did not include dating abuse and dating violence, and that there were not protections on campus to effectively protect somebody in a dating abuse situation like Maggie. So as parents and family, we decided we needed to do some things to change those 3 areas we identified and to honor Maggie with action. In 2001, Martha testified to the Michigan Domestic Violence Prevention Task Force along with other parent survivors about the need to designate dating violence as domestic violence with all the protections that apply to domestic violence too. It was impactful testimony from all survivor voices that talked to the bipartisan task force, which held hearings across the state that year, resulting in some domestic violence law changes. We also started to raise money, holding golf outings as Maggie was a golfer on the college golf team, and knitting hats as Martha is a knitter, became a knitter. We donated money to organizations like the Kalamazoo YWCA to fight domestic violence and spread the word about dating violence and the warning signs of it. We also started a fund in her honor and explored the idea of having talks with young people in schools about healthy relationships and the warning signs of dating abuse. We have been doing that in schools around our area, including Maggie's high school, Plainwell High School. Also, through our Remembering Maggie Fund at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, we have been giving grants to local groups, spreading that information to young people. We started advocating politically and legally for changes to the weak laws protecting women, especially in non-marital relationships. We worked through the Kalamazoo YWCA, the Million Moms March. We walked in the marches in DC with Maggie in our hearts. And these two posters here are Maggie's picture that our friends and we carried in 2004 at the Million Moms March. It's the picture that's right over our shoulder, the determined Maggie. We joined the Brady campaign in 2004 and then Moms Demand Action in 2013. We are actively part of Moms Demand Action locally and nationally, as well as the Everytown Survivor Network, joining with other survivors to change our pain into purpose. And together we are powerful advocates for change. We have lobbied in Washington, D.C. with our House representatives and senators, and we've been in Lansing for the past 24, almost 25 years, pushing and asking for changes that finally, partially, have come to fruition in Michigan this month. We appreciate our connection and advocacy with End Gun Violence Michigan these past 2 years. So that brings us to today. Right now, there are 4 laws we are talking about and elevating. The expanded background checks law, the extreme risk protection orders law, the child access protection law, and in particular, the domestic violence offenders restriction laws. And these laws can change a dangerous situation like Maggie found herself in 24 years ago. What matters now is that these changes in laws can save a life in danger now, someone's daughter or child. The young man that stole our daughter's life bought a gun at a gun store under the existing laws at that time. He purchased the shotgun, a long gun, because he was able to have it that weekend, rather than have to wait longer with more scrutiny for a handgun. This was in 1999. The changes in Michigan background check laws that we're talking about in this conference could have changed that too easy availability to him. Secondly, the extreme risk protection order today, bill that's a law, could today save someone like Maggie because the young man who had that shotgun in his hand was known to be suicidal and was angry at her, angry enough to hurt her. Under an extreme risk protection order process, a campus counselor or others could have petitioned for a protection order like an ERPO, and law enforcement, the security campus people. The new gun law that promotes the safe and secure storage of firearms has the potential to prevent firearms from getting to a campus or a school setting. What happened to Maggie was a shooting on a college campus, a tragedy that was traumatic for the whole campus community and all of Maggie's friends and his friends, impacting them for the rest of their lives. Lastly, and most importantly, keeping guns away from a convicted domestic violence abuser is an extremely important measure to protect women in relationships from dating domestic violence by their abuser. If Maggie had gotten out of that room that day, if he had not been able to hurt her with that gun when she turned to leave, and if he had been charged with domestic violence, then a law like this could have given Maggie protection that she didn't have that day in 1999. Martha and I, as you can see in the picture, were in attendance when the Domestic Violence Offenders Firearm Restrictions Bill was signed into law by Governor Whitmer at our local Kalamazoo YWCA in October 2023. These are the types of changes that these 4 laws can manifest. At Kalamazoo College every year, as sophomores, students start to put into words their Student Integrated Project. In short, a SIP. They call it a SIP all the time. Even now, every case student completes the SIP as a condition of graduating. Maggie, in 1999, in the start of her SIP, stated that she wanted to make a difference in the world. In her SIP introduction, she wrote these determined, impactful words for herself. I am no longer content to live a private life. The things I do can make a difference. Martha and I are determined for her to honor her and make that difference she was destined to accomplish. This is just the way it has happened for her through us. Thank you. We welcome questions We'll both answer questions. We've talked about Maggie many times in groups listening to her story. You can ask any questions about us, our advocacy, or the events leading up to Maggie's death, October 18th, 1999. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Rick and Martha, for reliving those painful memories for us, for those that are here to hear the testimony today, and for continuing to give Maggie a voice in this fight as well. I am going to hand things over to Heath Lowry to talk about the new laws we have passed to address these very situations that you have just now heard about.
Yes, good afternoon. As Tanesha just shared, my name is Heath Lowry. I'm a staff attorney and policy specialist with the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. We're an organization that represents over 70 domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking services providers across the state and every county. And in my role, I serve not only representing survivors directly in court, but I also work on our policy front as well. And we care very deeply. Obviously, it is our mission to bring about a world where domestic violence and sexual violence and human trafficking no longer exist. And really working hand in hand with stakeholders and policymakers and developing these laws is really a major pinpoint of our work. And I'm very proud of the work that's been done over the past few years, particularly in this last year, making sure that these major pieces of legislation move forward and got the support that they did. I know ERPO has been discussed quite handily in other situations, so I'm really going to focus on the change to the domestic violence laws here. Dr. Zeoli did a wonderful primer with this during her part, but there was a real need for applying federal law to the state level law because the restrictions that exist on the federal level had a hard time being enforced here in Michigan, simply because local law enforcement enforces state and local laws and not federal laws. And that was taking a tool away from our local law enforcement to prevent gun violence and domestic violence situations. So we worked with stakeholders to develop a law that addresses this loophole in the law that allows law enforcement or for systems to prohibit people who have committed serious crimes of domestic violence but didn't reach that felony level of prosecution to be prohibited from possessing a firearm. This is very important because, as Dr. Zeoli laid out, the presence of a firearm is very dangerous in domestic violence situations. So we want to save lives is what it really came down to. Senate Bill 471 and the accompanying bills by Representative O'Neill and Senator Schenck were able to create a system of several crimes that if someone's been convicted of it, they are prohibited from possessing a firearm for 8 years beyond the point of when their sentence is done, they've paid all the fines, and they've completed all terms of probation for those crimes. These are all misdemeanors, which means that typically the maximum sentence for any of these crimes is between 93 days and 1 year. By definition, longer than a year is a felony under this law. So that's it can be a significant amount of time, but anywhere from 8 years to 9, 10, maybe, depending on how long it takes them to complete this, the terms of that sentence. And we see this as critical to make sure that this sort of violence doesn't get perpetrated quickly afterward. The crimes that are covered under these laws are misdemeanor domestic violence, and that means an assaultive crime versus anyone that has been in a dating relationship with the perpetrator, an individual with who they have a child in common, or is a resident or former resident of that same person's household. That's a pretty standard definition of domestic violence within Michigan law. As Dr. Zeoli pointed out, there is still room for improvement on that definition to include greater degrees of dating relationships that weren't previously covered. And this thing also includes assault and battery, our typical laws, misdemeanor assault and battery that may be against a person that fits this domestic violence definition. It includes breaking and entering, vulnerable adult abuse, malicious destruction of property, stalking, and malicious use of telecommunications. And we included this list of crimes because domestic violence isn't always charged under the domestic violence statute. Prosecutors are tasked with proving beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime existed, and they go with the evidence that is before them. So domestic violence takes many different forms, and different crimes may apply to the situation. But when it really boils down to it, it's all that dangerous domestic violence that increases lethality with a firearm. So we wanted to make sure we capture all those crimes. Very happy to work with all the people on this call during the process, and with lawmakers to make sure that we're really hearing the voice of survivors and people who weren't able to survive a domestic violence situation throughout the process.
Thank you so much, Heath, for providing us with that information. It is so critical and important, the work that you do, so thank you as well. I am going to hand things over to Sergeant Kristina Droste from the Michigan State Police. Sergeant Droste, in your experience, tell us, why are these laws so important?
Thank you very much, Tanesha, and thank you to my partners on this panel who have spoken so far already. Mr. and Mrs. Omillian, every time I hear more about your daughter, Maggie, I am truly moved and inspired, and grateful for the opportunity to partner with you, truly. For those, I see some familiar names and faces in our attendees as well, but for those who do not know me, I am a sergeant in the state police, and I serve as a legislative liaison for the department. But my role here with this panel is due to the fact that laws on domestic violence and relatedly laws on crime victims' rights are within my area of responsibility and expertise for my department. I've studied intimate partner violence since I was an undergrad at the University of Michigan. And I've practiced laws of domestic violence and crime victims' rights as an assistant prosecutor before I joined the state police. I saw, practicing in the courtroom, that there were a lot of areas for improvement in both the judicial segment of these crimes and these incidents and these relationships, but also in the field as well. So that was actually why I became a trooper. I thought, you know what, I could do a better job if I'm responding to incidents involving intimate partner violence and other victim crimes as well. You know, if I'm responding in the moment rather than handling them later on in a courtroom. And I was pleased to do that as a law enforcement officer, but I still saw that we were lacking in areas of our practice, our training, and even the laws themselves. I took that courtroom and practical experience to training other law enforcement officers. So I teach recruits now, people who will become law enforcement officers, on domestic violence laws, victims' rights, and other laws. But I try to instill in them this broader understanding of their ability to impact the safety, the well-being, and the future of these cases that they respond to, that it's not just that one moment in which they respond. And I feel like I'm able to make a bigger difference there because I'm reaching more individuals. You know, I can only respond to so many 911 calls, but if I can instill in other law enforcement officers these same principles and motivations, then we can reach more survivors. We can help more people. Still, though, I thought, you know what, there are just so many areas where we need to improve. You know, we're getting better at responding. We're getting better at our training, our teaching, but the laws themselves, there's room for improvement. And so now I get to do that as a legislative liaison, beyond just enforcing the laws that we already have, now I work with many partners here and in other areas to improve the laws that we have. And so I was very grateful to work on many of these firearms packages we're talking about. The red flag laws, I'm thrilled that we are where we are. I think as a law enforcement officer, that package is important to me because we knew already as law enforcement officers exactly the circumstances in which we needed that tool. I can't tell you how many officers I've spoken to about our ERPO Act, and after I explained it, this was early on before our trainings. After I explained what that tool was, they said, yeah, I know exactly when I would have used that. We have all responded to many incidents in which we felt like our hands were tied because there was not a criminal act, but we knew very clearly that the individual posed a severe risk of harm to themselves or others. Safe storage. This to me is so easy and simple. That is responsible gun ownership, undoubtedly. And I think we all can recognize that with the right of gun ownership comes the responsibility to do so responsibly. And so if someone is unwilling to meet that responsibility, we have to either have consequences or steeper incentives to encourage them to do so, to exercise that right responsibly. Universal background checks. Simple, easy. Why would we have all of these laws about the eligibility or ineligibility or prohibitions on firearm ownership if we're not going to properly ensure that gun buyers are eligible? So that, again, is just a simple, easy one for me. The biggest one is our prohibited person or misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence prohibitor legislation. That Senate Bill 471 and 528, and then the House bill accompanying. That has been a labor of love, I think, for many individuals involved in these conversations, frankly. I think why it's so important to me is it demonstrates so much collaboration from broad perspectives. Anytime we're talking about gun control or firearm restrictions, we're struggling as a society or a nation to pinpoint both who we should be including in prohibitions and who we should not be. We're always trying to, appropriately tailor prohibitions. Who deserves to exercise that right of gun ownership, but who has forfeited that right? Before this legislation, we had our felon in possession statute, the same statute, just we called it felon in possession. And even there, we struggled at times. There is a significant difference between someone convicted of a felony for check forgery and someone convicted of a felony for, say, carrying a pistol concealed illegally. And so that's the battle we're always having. But for this conversation, to me, there's no clearer category of individuals who should be prohibited from possessing firearms than those who have been convicted of crimes of domestic violence. To me, when we talk about red flags, when we talk about predictors of future violence, what clearer predictor or red flag can we see than someone who has been convicted of domestic violence crimes? So to me, I think that's why it led to such a simple but well-crafted and well-tailored result here, is because we brought all of those unique perspectives and backgrounds together. We talked to members about the difficulty in reaching a conviction. I think that was a huge factor in the success of these bills, explaining and educating the public, but also specifically our legislative members on what it really truly takes in these circumstances for someone to be convicted. And with that background from so many of us understanding this area, it really became clearer to the members what I'm saying, what I knew deep in my soul for so long, that this is the most clear category of individuals who should not be possessing firearms. And so that's the big policy importance to me. I think on a somewhat personal or almost selfish level, I'm a huge fan of these laws as well as a law enforcement officer. Individuals who commit domestic violence and who have been convicted of domestic violence are some of the most dangerous individuals to law enforcement officers. When law enforcement responds to an incident involving domestic violence, we are on higher alert than ever. And then you think about the subsequent or repeat offenders, and that is, again, another heightened risk factor for law enforcement officers. So by having a tool in place that takes guns out of the hands of people who have been convicted of these crimes, now when law enforcement is responding a subsequent time, we now have some greater protections in place to protect my brothers, my sisters in law enforcement as well. So I'm thrilled at what we have accomplished. I know Dr. Zeoli and I could not agree more on some things we have to do further. But that's why all of those laws are incredibly important to me and to law enforcement.
Thank you so much, Sergeant Droste, for just all of your knowledge and even being a part of the conversation as law enforcement, because that is so critical, and bringing all of that expertise to the table. Now, we all know that everyone here that these laws do not just happen. There is a lot of advocacy work that's necessary, sometimes sleepless nights and getting the work done. And I personally know that because I have worked alongside many of you that are here today and that are on this panel. So I'm going to turn it back over to Heath and ask you, can you just tell us a little bit about the process that went into passing these bills?
Yeah, first and foremost, a lot of sleepless nights and community action. As all the people here are wonderful advocates throughout the process, and along with actions of groups like End Gun Violence Michigan, which held rallies in various and diverse communities across the state on different days, just rallying the grassroots movement to make sure that legislators knew what their constituents wanted. Especially and that it extends to partners of End Gun Violence Michigan, many of which who sit on here, mobilize their own networks to make sure that people were speaking to their legislators about these very important issues. As advocacy groups go, each of us had individual meetings with legislators, especially those in key positions in the process, such as committee members and leadership, to make sure that we knew that this was an immediate need and that they knew how serious we were about making sure that these laws go into effect as soon as possible. We had survivors and experts turn out to the hearings along the process in both the Senate and in the House of Representatives. Thankful for the testimony of people like the Omillians, who really brought that heart to the numbers that we had here. We all provided our own viewpoint, but in a common mission of making sure that survivors are being heard and we're preventing future violence. I'm very thankful for survivors and everyone else who was able to to use the trauma that they've experienced to bring about positive change in the world. And I cannot understate the kind of strength it takes to go through something like that and to be able to speak on it. And I'm just thankful for all those that are here and for people that are interested in this, like all of you watching now. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Heath. I think you summed it all up when you said a community because it took not just those who, like you said, are on the committees, but those who have had the experiences as well to humanize the bills and why they exist and why they're so critical. So thank you for honing in on that, and also for all of your efforts in this work as well. I want to introduce and bring forward Christin Perry. Christin has a very unique voice as a therapist and member of Giffords Gun Owners for Safety. Christin, can you tell us a bit about your own advocacy journey and the role that gun owners themselves need to play in the gun violence prevention movement?
Sure. As you said, I am Christin Perry, and my journey really began as a therapist. I graduated from Central Michigan University in 2004 with my master's in professional counseling, and have been a therapist for this year will be my 20 years. And in that almost 2 decades, I have worked in a variety of settings. I have worked in community mental health for a number of years, doing home-based, outpatient, school-based. I have worked at a community college, and I have also worked in foster care for a little while in Pennsylvania, and then also private practice therapy as well. And what I will say with all of that background is that through specializing in trauma, specifically with children, domestic violence is something that has come up in each and every one of those settings. Despite all of those different work environments I've been in, domestic violence comes up, regardless of socioeconomic status, demographic. Domestic violence is present, it comes up. It is something that is very real for people everywhere, and is something that very much comes up as a source of trauma for many children, families, women, men, everybody in between. And what I'll say is that that really is the reason that I became involved in doing advocacy work around gun violence. I was hearing so many trauma stories from children that I was working with, where not only community violence, where firearms were playing a role in that, where people's parents were killed or cousins were killed, but also the level of domestic violence that were happening in homes that children were talking about, seeing the presence of guns in the home. I very much had concern about safe storage, laws around domestic violence, ERPO laws, all of those things, where I was seeing all of these things and was often working so hard to work with the families on safety planning. Right. So it would be a child is coming to see me and they're talking about some kind of domestic violence in the home, or maybe the mother was, and then we are trying to do safety planning of where is this family going to go? How are they going to be safe? Women's shelters, do they have a family member to go to where they can't be found? Knowing that there really was a gap in the laws to support keeping them safe as they were getting out of relationships, potentially out of homes where there were violence. And also knowing that the time when somebody leaves a domestic violence relationship is also the time that they're at greatest risk. Finding ways to keep people safe without enough laws to support that was very difficult. And that, along with all these other, situations of community violence, really was what led me to advocacy work that I do. I got involved in Moms Demand Action back in 2017, met a lot of other advocates in this work. And then about 2.5 years ago, I became involved in Giffords Gun Owners for Safety after also becoming a gun owner myself. My own living situation changed. And I did a lot of time making the decision whether I was going to become a gun owner or not. And trust me when I say that was not a decision that I took lightly by any means. I have 2 children. They are now 9 and 13. And weighing what is the best way to keep myself and my children safe. Is it safer to have a gun in the home? Is it safer to not have a gun in the home? What I ultimately decided in weighing all the aspects was I felt safer having a gun in my home as a last resort if needed. But what I did first to make sure that I felt okay about that was to buy the safe first. I made sure that I had a safe in my home first before I had the handgun in my home. I made sure I know how to use that safe. I thought about where to keep the backup keys where my kids would never find that. I made sure to get a safe where it needs my fingerprint, it needs my face to get into the app. I thought long and hard about all the safety aspects of making that decision, because I know that once you have a gun in the home, if you are not taking all of those safety precautions, it can up the chance of violence in the home. So I knew that having a gun in my home could keep me safe, but I had to make sure all of those things were in place. I needed to consider all of those things. I also know, because of my background as a therapist and all of these families that I have met with and safety planned with, that if my situation were to ever change and anybody in my home is ever a danger to themselves or somebody else, if somebody else enters my home and they became a danger to me or my children, then all of that goes out the window and I need to reassess everything. I may need to make sure that that gun is no longer in my home. I may need to change what my living situation is to ensure safety. And that is why these laws are so important, because you need the laws to support all of that safety planning that families have to face. It is hard to make all of those decisions, and we need the laws that really support the people, whether it is families, whether it is therapists, whether it's healthcare providers, whether it is law enforcement. We need those laws that have our back, that say, if somebody is a danger to somebody, they cannot have access to a gun. And we need the laws that say, this is how we can implement that real world in homes, in families. This is how we can implement that to make sure that people stay safe. And I think also, as a gun owner, that's also why it's so important that other gun owners like myself become involved in this advocacy work, because too often people see our voices as aligning with very strict black and white thinking of either you have guns and you don't support any kind of laws or restrictions or anything like that, or you support these laws, but you want all guns taken away. And that is the furthest from the truth. I have a gun in my home. I want the freedom to have a gun in my home. I also know that part of my freedom as a person, a mom, a therapist, is also knowing that I need laws that support, where if I need a gun removed from my hands or the hands of somebody else to keep me safe, that also allows me freedom. So we need both of those sides here. And that is why it is so important for other gun owners that also believe, as I do, that you can have a gun in your home. And being truly a responsible gun owner means that you also then support a lot of these laws, that it means being responsible, that it means securing them, that it means assessing for safety. And that does not go against each other. I encourage any other gun owners that might be on this webinar or hearing this later on to get on the Giffords site, reach out to us. We would love for you to join us and partner in all of this. All of our stories are important in pushing these laws and this work forward. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Christin. You talked about, I introduced you as this unique voice, and we appreciate all of what you've had to share here today, and especially your personal experience and analyzing as a gun owner, a responsible gun owner. So thank you so much for that information as well.
Thank you.
We are actually going to go into questions for the panel at this time. We do have some questions for the panel, and then I also please know that we do see that there is a question in the Q&A for the panel as well that we will also get to make sure that we don't miss anyone. And so this is a question for the panel. The first question would be, we've talked about having laws, but we know that it continues to be a process, as Mr. Heath Lowry so eloquently spoke about. So what do we have to do now to implement the new laws?
I can go and then Sergeant Droste. I'm going to echo what I pointed out earlier. Just thinking of that misdemeanor conviction for domestic violence law, it's one thing to say this person is no longer allowed to have a gun, because they've been convicted. It is another thing to make sure that they don't have a gun and that they can't purchase a gun. Now, Michigan's purchaser licensing law that we amended this past year in 2023 will help prevent purchase and make sure that people who have been convicted and are disqualified either for this misdemeanor conviction or an extremist protection order or a personal protection order, that those people can't purchase a gun because there'll be a background check and they'll be disqualified. But it's that part about people who already have guns in their homes, they already possess guns, that we really need to make sure we think long and hard about how we do that. There are certain ways we can identify, who has a gun, because that's the first question: who has, does that person have a gun? We have sources of information in Michigan. We can use our hunting licenses, our concealed carry licenses, our firearm purchaser licenses. If somebody has any one of those three, they probably have a gun. And, we can use that to identify people who have guns. And then a protocol needs to be in place. And this might come down to jurisdictional level. This is where Sergeant Droste can answer this question better than I can. So I'll turn it over to her, but there needs to be a mechanism for removal.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zeoli. I agree. I think there's a few different areas where I could focus on this with the implementation of each of these laws. As you may have noticed from my earlier minutes, I could go on forever about this stuff. I think the big one that I get asked about the most, I'll start there with implementation, is ERPO, red flag, especially because of the huge role that law enforcement plays in that. And because that really, of all these that we're talking about, is the most new, I guess I'll call it. The biggest step for us as far as implementation goes is really just educating and training members of law enforcement. Like I mentioned earlier, we already know exactly when this tool is needed. We've seen it. We have so many times been there and said, wow, I wish I could do something. If I had a tool, like I know some other states have, I would use it right now. So the biggest step that we need to take for that implementation, which we are taking, is just educating and training our law enforcement officers. A big step of that is kind of co-training with law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges so that we all understand the procedural roles here as well. And then that kind of honestly gets me into, I think, back to the relinquishment aspect that kind of overarches all of this. Particularly when we're talking about the prohibited person, the misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence legislation, the relinquishment is the biggest piece. And that's kind of like the, what more do we need to do? What's next aspect? Because we do have tools. It is a crime under that statute for a prohibited person to be possessing. So we do have criminal procedure tools in our tool belt, but we need to bridge the gap between, that triggering moment in time of the conviction or the, judge's signature on an ERPO, whatever that moment in time where someone becomes a prohibited person. We have to bridge the gap from that to dispossessing that individual of their firearms. And we did work a lot in the ERPO Act to make sure that that relinquishment piece was included. And that's part of what goes into our training and education to our law enforcement officers. We're working more still on getting that relinquishment aspect, or that bridge, as I call it, in place for something like, the prohibited person criminal statute. We've so much taken a wait and see approach with prohibitions like that. Over the past 30 years, I could tell you so many examples with felon in possession where it was just wait and see. After a conviction, wait and see if you catch somebody on a traffic stop with a gun who's not supposed to have it. Or more tragically and more common, wait and see until they commit another crime with a firearm, and then simply add it as another charge, rather than trying to do something proactively to prevent that from happening in the first place. I say this all the time, good enough is not good enough. We're not done. I refuse to stop. And so, as we move forward, we're going to continue to make sure that relinquishment is a huge aspect of ERPO, and we're implementing that properly and effectively, and implementing things like that in other areas as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zeoli and Sergeant Droste. Just a follow-up question in terms of ERPO, and you talked about the relinquishment, but we also know give us insight as to when we're talking about funding to be able to file and to actually implement, as we've already discussed.
Yeah, as someone who works directly with advocates in multiple programs across the state, the resources to assist advocates who already were and others who are eligible to file ERPO, extreme risk protection orders, making sure that they have the knowledge and resources available to make sure that they can utilize this tool to make sure that it's saving lives. Here, again, domestic and sexual violence advocates are often the kind of people who do as much as they can with historically decreasing amounts of resources. And we should continue that sort of mindset, because it's, I prefer an abundance mindset. We need to provide for things that are our safety net in our communities. And without these advocates, there's a lot of failures in systems that could be very deadly for survivors. So yes, funding for not only within domestic and sexual violence advocacy networks, but also just those who are able to. There's a whole class of people that are eligible to file these ERPOs, and making sure that the tool will be 100% implemented in the way that it should be.
Thank you so much, Heath, for that information as well. I am going to provide, we have 3 questions right now. The next question is, how is the public being made aware of these laws outside of news reporting? Will there be billboards, social media, push, etc.?
I think it's a tough one that we all kind of have that same facial expression in response to, because there are different approaches, right? So from our perspective as law enforcement, we're making sure we're educating our department, our members, and our partners in law enforcement. We're working with, those involved directly in the criminal justice system to do that, including prosecutors, judges, the Supreme Court scale, that's kind of our world of making sure we're educating individuals. And then we do it kind of on a personal level when we're responding to things. And, we interact with individuals of the public, members of the public who might be seeking something like an ERPO, or asking about how to safely store. So some of it, we do on a personal level as well. Go ahead, Christin.
Thank you. Anyone else to that question before I present the next question?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that, I know it's very early, but I know End Gun Violence Michigan is going to be launching an ad campaign with some help with creative material. There's a organization that is donating work towards this. So I know it's very early stages. Oh, I'm getting message. It's Lafayette American. I couldn't remember the name off the top of my head. That's it. But I know it's very early stages, so not sure exactly what all that is going to look like. But they are going to be doing some focus groups, it sounds like, and kind of getting an idea from the public, from gun owners, non-gun owners, people that live in different areas of the state, what really is going to be helpful in terms of getting the message out to the public, to make people aware of all of these laws and how they are actually helpful for people to keep people safe, which is what we're all going for.
And I will add that here at the University of Michigan, I and others have been creating a website for extreme risk protection orders. It will go live very soon. We were hoping to have the Michigan process and forms for it, but we obviously don't yet. But the informational site walks people through what you need to do, who might benefit from an extreme risk protection order, what to do if you work in a school or you're a healthcare provider, you're a family member, law enforcement. When the Michigan process is available, we'll walk you through that, link to the forms. And we also have a webpage for if you're a respondent to an extreme risk protection order. What do you do? How do you need to comply with the law? So this will be the kind of very dry academic side of things. What do you do? What does the evidence say? But it'll be informative.
Thank you so much. And I think you all made critical points, because a lot of times when you're on the advocacy side versus education, you have allocated funding just to provide advocacy, right? And it doesn't allow room for ads and things. So this is the importance of community. Our next question is, how does the panel see making the relinquishment process safe, or at least more safe?
I think this one falls on me. Law enforcement is, responsible for that relinquishment piece. And I want to highlight something that Dr. Zeoli said before I answer the question. Sorry. Utilizing ERPO in addition to other prohibitors as that relinquishment tool. I think that's, a very good thing to highlight. And with that, we worked really hard with stakeholders, legislators, everybody on the relinquishment aspect of ERPO to make sure that we were considering that safety. We put tools in the process already, anticipating possibilities, like every contingency we could think of. We considered, we have the opportunity to get anticipatory search warrants, which will assist us in having a tool if and when someone is not cooperative. We have emergency ex parte orders that would assist us in doing something immediately, like without even minutes of delay, when we're already responding to a situation in which an ERPO would be appropriate and relinquishment therefore appropriate as well. So we built a lot of those things into directly the legislation. There are also, of course, like law enforcement tools we have tactically and investigatorily that assist us in being safer. But I think those tools written right into the legislation are huge.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sergeant Droste, for that information as well. And 2 more questions, you guys. In terms of ERPO, is there a fear of retaliation against the petitioners, especially concerning intimate partner violence cases?
I can start. There's always a fear of retaliation in intimate partner violence cases. That is just unfortunately the situation. We don't always see retaliation. There is a group of people who abuse that I like to refer to as the otherwise law-abiding abusers. And now I've said it on recording, so there you go. But these are people who are going to, if law enforcement tells them they need to turn in their guns, they're going to do it. And, if they're under a restraining order, they're not going to violate it. Now, there are people who are going to violate a PPO, and there are people who are going to, attempt to retaliate. And this is one of the reasons that implementation of these firearm restrictions is so important, like actually get the firearms out of their hands so that they can't retaliate with the most assured means of lethal violence. And of course, there are other protections, that we can provide survivors of intimate partner violence as well that can be used in conjunction with these policies and orders.
Yeah, and I want to echo mainly everything that Dr. Zeoli shared, but and also in the case of intimate partner violence, that's why it's best to lead with a survivor-centered approach. The survivor knows their situation best and they're most able to assess whether that retaliation is a serious factor or not. So we don't file ERCOs on behalf of a survivor without their approval. So it's sort of it's not every solution is perfect for every survivor, and we just have to realize that in our systems.
I want to kind of speak to that as well. As a therapist, I've had to make many child protective service calls, and similarly with that, sometimes that can very much be a concern, right? If I'm meeting with a child and they're reporting some kind of abuse in the home, it's a concern if I make the call and then somebody is then aware, somebody goes out to the home or whatever, then is that child in more danger because now that parent or whoever has been looked at, is there going to be, is the abuse going to escalate? But again, like Heath said, that's where we have to work with the families and really figure out what is the best way to keep everybody safe. That's always a risk. But the alternative is not addressing it. We definitely cannot do that. So we need to address it and safety plan the best way that we can around that. And, like was mentioned earlier, is that the removal really does help create more safety around this. If we know that the weapons are not in the home, it definitely decreases the risk of lethal retaliation in this process of what can be potentially escalating violence situation.
Thank you so much. We are wrapping up. We are here at time, but I will ask this last question if one or two of you would like to answer it before we wrap up. And that is probably the most important is, what else do we need to do to make survivors safe?
I can start. Yes. Well, there's a lot of things that systems can do to improve, but I think the best solution is to prevent domestic violence in the first place, to set up systems, safety nets that allow people freedom and to reduce vulnerability to perpetrator actions, is really what it comes down to, whether that's economic related freedoms and just equality in the workplace. There's a whole plethora of things we can do here, and we don't have enough time for it. But violence prevention, scholarship, it applies very heavily to domestic violence prevention and scholarship as well.
Yeah, I would echo that need for primary prevention, but I'll go the other way. Let's not make perpetrators. There are some universal school-based interventions that are very promising in reducing dating violence among high schoolers. And we think that continues. But this is something that we need to start at a really young age with, respect for others, conflict resolution, gender equality, not having those traditional, gender stereotypes that are so limiting and breed violence. So there are things that we can do, and there are things we can do, once we have violence, but that's not 1 minute answer.
I completely agree. Thank you all so much. I want to thank the panel so much for being here today, for being so diligent in all the hard work that you do in your jobs and outside of our jobs, because we know this is a 24-hour, 7-day in our minds, at least when we're doing this work. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for such an important topic. And again, if you want to get involved, there is information in the chat if you would love to get involved with this work. So thank you again and have a great day.